So thank you everyone for being here. We will start the panel about handling balance of payment problems. What are the possible solutions? Our guest speakers are Peter Doyle, and Anne Löscher. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the speakers. So Peter is a former senior economist at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, who sent a blistering resignation letter to the IMF Executive Board on July 18th in 2012. It was a letter widely reported on international medias, where he criticized the IMF handling of the euro crisis, blaming management for suppressing staff warnings about the financial crisis, and failed to issue timely and sustained warnings to European leaders ahead of the debt crisis, and that this had caused sufferings for many countries, like Greece, and left the euro on the brink. Since then, Peter Doyle works and writes on economics for reparations, slavery for economics, sovereign debt restructuring, and global early warnings. In his speech today, called A Pre-emptive Sovereign Insolvency Regime, Peter argues for the sovereign insolvency regime to be brought in line with that for banks in highly indebted countries, though with high growth potential. I'm going to introduce Anne also. So Anne will present her speech will be about being poor in the current financial architecture, implications of foreign currency shortage for African economies, and possible solutions. So Anne studied political science and economics at Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg in Germany, and in University of London. Her PhD project focuses on financialization in sub-Saharan economies. She's involved in the network Plural Economics, which is committed to a critical approach to traditional doctrines in the economic sciences. Her research interests are history of economics, monetary theories, development economies, and financializations. So are you ready, Peter?
I'm going to have a very difficult challenge now because the slides are not working for me. So I'm going to attempt something seriously ambitious without pictures. And it is the following.
Do you need some help?
Sorry?
Your mic a bit.
Okay, so I know that this is a conference about Africa, but I'm going to talk about Jamaica. And the reason I'm going to talk about Jamaica is not because of Bob Marley or Usain Bolt, or everyone thinks he's American, but he's actually Jamaican, General Colin Powell. I'm going to talk about macro developments in Jamaica over the last decade. And the reason I'm going to do that without pictures is because they illustrate in a way which no other case can that the present system for resolving insolvent sovereigns is intellectually bankrupt. I can actually quantify it, and I could show you the quantifications if I had the pictures, but I'm going to talk you through them anyway. And not only that, but from the case of Jamaica, you can see that the only way to describe the present system is, and this is no rhetorical flourish, is as a debtor's prison. Remember that notion from Dickensian world where a creditor, if upset by a debtor who didn't pay, could throw the debtor into prison, into jail, literally. Well, nowadays we regard that kind of approach to resolving bankruptcy as barbaric. So we don't do it for persons or for corporates. But it is, as the case of Jamaica shows, what we do for sovereigns. And having developed that argument that in fact you can quantify the cost of this, I wanted to lay out an alternative. What is a different way that could be done to resolve insolvent sovereigns, which is not a debtor's prison? How might that actually look? And then I wanted to just explain some of the broader benefits, macro benefits of doing that to you. All right, so have I got your attention? Yes. Do you think I can do all of that in 20 minutes without pictures? Okay, so here goes. I was going to say,
Peter,
here is, no, it's not going to work. I'm going to keep going.
We don't try.
No, we're going. Here is the Jamaican macro. What you see in Jamaica in the last decade is, in the period where it's entirely under IMF programs from 2009 to 2017, very weak growth for 10 years. So it dips during the Great Repression, -2, -3, then it goes +1, -1, half, up until 2018 when it's 1.2. This is after 10 years of doing what it was told. And that's the crucial thing. This is what makes Jamaica so unusual and so informative. After 10 years of doing what it was told, it did not grow. All right? So as you look down the rest of the macro information, the thing that sticks out to you like a sore thumb is its primary balance. Explain what the primary balance is on the budget. Revenues minus all expenditures of the government, but not including the interest expenditures. What you see in the case of Jamaica is that number is normally 7% of GDP. It's 9% of GDP at one point. So by the end of the period, it gets to about 7. Just to give you some order of magnitude in comparison, for the UK, the primary balance is about -1 or 0, not +7. In order for the UK to get to a primary surplus of +7 or 8, which is what Jamaica has, the UK would have to completely shut down most of the NHS. So you fall sick, you just don't get medical care, period. The UK could also, instead of shutting down its NHS, it could jack up its VAT from 20 to about 29, I think, in one go. That gives you an idea of just how incredibly out of whack the Jamaican budget is, under IMF instruction. Why does it do that? Says the IMF, well, because Jamaica has this other thing you see in its macro, very high debt, 140% of GDP at the beginning of the period 2008-9, whittling down to about 90% of GDP by the end of the period. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what the Jamaican macro looks like. When most, I should call them regular people, regular economists look at that, they say, gosh, why is Jamaica growing so slowly? When I looked at that, I said, how is Jamaica growing at all under these circumstances with a primary that high? Because I come to Jamaica having been burnt, as I was referred to very recently, by my encounter with Greece. And what you saw going on in Greece was very extraordinary developments in the Greek primary associated with a collapse of output. So my question was, why does output collapse in Greece and only sort of dribble along at 111 in the case of Jamaica? What's going on here? Now, if you talk to the main macroeconomists in the world, Olivier Blanchard and people like that, they will say the difference is that in Greece, the primary adjusted a lot from -10 to +14. And those numbers are correct, by the way. Just wrap into your head how many times the NHS has to be cancelled to produce that, okay? And through multipliers, okay, you're contracting demand on the fiscal, demand collapses, Greek output collapses, all right? Trouble with that explanation is that if you think all that's going on in this story is a collapse of demand through the multipliers, that would imply that Greek output capacity remained very high, but nothing was happening to that. You would expect to see enormous output gaps, 30% of GDP. You'd expect to see inflation falling like a stone, but it doesn't. It falls very, very slowly, which tells you that the demand side story for Greece on its primary is not true. There's something else going on, or at least it's not the whole story. So now I want to abstract a little bit from Greece and a little bit from Jamaica and do some very basic economics, because this next bit of economic story is not told often enough to get it into people's heads. So you're going to be my guinea pigs for the next 3 minutes while I make you solve an economic problem. And here's how it goes. Okay, imagine in your head you've got an imaginary country, which is what, you just imagine it. And it's got a government, and on the revenue side of its government budget, everything is what you consider to be perfect. It's got the right level of VAT, the right level of corporate taxes, the right level of everything, the right tax administration. It is nirvana. If you're an MMT person, it's got MMT taxes for you, whatever you want. Okay? On the expenditure side of this theoretical government, you've also got perfection. Again, if you're an MMT person, you've got MMT expenditures on that side over there. If you're not, you're like the Nordic model, okay, you've got Nordic expenditures, whatever you like. Perfection, okay? And lo and behold, this perfection carries on to the real sector of the economy, the actual way the economy works. Again, if you're an MMT person, you've got MMT, real sector. If you're a Nordic person, you've got, or if you believe in free trade, you've got free trade. Whatever your definition of perfection is. Starting from that, I want you to do a comparative statics exercise. So we're not changing from one year to the next. We're changing the permanent state from one permanent state to another permanent state in our heads. So beginning in your perfection, you've got a primary deficit in this perfection government of, let's say, 4% of GDP. That's the deficit, okay? Now I'm going to ask you, and associated with all of this perfection is an output trajectory for the future, which is pretty strong because you've got perfection. So output out 5, 10 years is way higher than it is now. Now, change your primary from -4 to -3. Comparative statics. It's not 1 year to the next. It's not permanently 4 anymore. It's now permanently 3. And then do it again. It's now from -3 to -2 permanently. My question for you is, you keep doing this until you get to Jamaican numbers of +7. What is happening to this output trajectory into the future? And you've got 3 options. Either that output trajectory is going higher than when you started, it's staying the same as when you started, or it's falling compared to where you started. Show of hands for it's going up compared to where you started. Show of hands for it's staying the same as where you started. Show of hands, it's falling compared to where you started. Big majority for falling. Somebody tell me why it's falling. Anybody? Silence. Well, I'm on the side who say it's falling because you're taking away the NHS. You started off with -4, and to get from -4 up to 7, you've got to wipe out your healthcare. All right? +7, right? Yes, from -4 to +7. You've wiped out healthcare. So you get sick now, you get a beautiful graduate trained at whatever local university, falls off his bicycle, age 25, and is dead because there's lack of any healthcare to fix him or her up. It drops. Now, this is a story that's happening on the supply side. This is the crucial thing. If you squeeze your theoretical perfection government simply by raising the primary step by step by step, you squeeze the supply side. That's the story. This is not multipliers. Okay? This is a supply side story. So now my question is, well, how do you quantify this effect? It's all very well to have this in your head. How big is it? Again, nice pictures would be on the board. In order to do this, to quantify it, you need to get a comparator group. You can see what's happening in Jamaica. Jamaica's had it now, this squeeze on the primary for a decade. What's a comparator group that you could pick to compare Jamaica to see what they did differently and how the outcomes were different? My answer is Africa. African countries are the relevant comparator group for Jamaica. So I went and I looked at them. Not just any African countries. We're comparing policies designed by the IMF. These are the hotshot people, apparently. All right? They ought to be able to manage not the average African with respect, muddle, but the best Africans. Okay? The IMF ought to be able to know what the secret sauce is that the best Africans have. So I picked the best Africans to compare Jamaica to. And the Africans with the highest growth came in 2 groups. There was a group of countries with a growth of GDP, with GDP per capita below Jamaica. That was Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And there was another group of countries with GDP per capita a bit higher than Jamaica. That was Namibia, Botswana, and Mauritius. And you look at what they did over the same decade, 2009 to now, and what you see is on average, with the poorer ones growing faster, you see that they grow about 70%, comparing 2019 comparing to the beginning of the period. That's particularly Kenya and Uganda. Namibia and Botswana are a bit lower than that. Do that in per capita terms, and it comes a bit low, because some of these countries have got rapidly growing populations. When you compare that to what Jamaica did in per capita terms, the difference at the end of the period is 40% of Jamaican start of period GDP. That says when your IMF is running your country, Jamaica, over a decade, other best performing similar countries can beat you by 40% compared with your starting GDP. That is a colossal number. Colossal. Now, when I went into the IMF and berated them for this, what's the first thing do you think they did? Answer, they tried desperately to find any answer to this which is not the primary balance. That's what they were looking for. Can we come up with an answer for our poor performance in Jamaica compared with our comparator group, which is not because we have this exceptional primary surplus? And they came up with two explanations. One, Jamaica has a lot of crime. They used a very, very appalling word, which I took them to task for with, but they had a lot of crime. To which I said, no answer. It's not news that Jamaica doesn't have a lot of crime. The problem is, your programming ignored it. You should have been addressing policies so that you are tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, which means spending on police and on courts. And why are you not doing that? Because you've got this enormous primary surplus target. So they didn't give up the NHS, they gave up crime prevention. And they got low growth. So I said, back we are to our initial point, which is the primary. Then I said, they came with another explanation. Oh, it's because of hurricanes. To which I said, it is no news in 2009 that Jamaica is in Hurricane Valley. So why do hurricanes exact such a toll on Jamaica? Answer, because you have a huge primary balance surplus target, which means you can't spend on hurricane defenses or on hurricane recovery. Back we come to the primary. There is nothing wrong with Jamaica compared with its African comparators, except that it has an extremely high level of debt, which the IMF has forced it to address by running these very high primary surpluses, period. And the difference is 40% of GDP, of starting period GDP. Now, when you think of the amount of work that all sorts of development experts do to try and find, half a percentage point of GDP gain here and there from, I don't know, better rural health care or whatever. Think of the Nobel Prize winners just recently and the sort of work that they do in economics, tweaking the way benefit systems are paid and so on. It is absolute pennies. This compared to this is gigantic in terms of its impact. That's the cost of the present system of sovereign insolvency. That's why I call it a debtor's prison. And the fact that it costs so much is an outrage. The problem with all of that is, even though it is outrageous, and even though the case of Jamaica can demonstrate with numbers how much this actually costs in terms of output, the fact of the matter is that creditors love it. Creditors love debtors' prisons. They get their money back, or they think they do. They are not concerned, and here's the key concept, with output foregone. What Jamaica lost over that decade was output foregone of 40% of GDP. That's not the creditors' problem. The creditors got their money back. The other headache with this whole problem is that it's not just creditors who like this system of a debtor's prison, and here I need to be careful how I speak. It is also many of the individual leaders of borrowing countries, including your own. Why? Because they individually, as individuals, can now go to foreign banks and borrow like crazy, and those foreign banks will lend them to do all sorts of crazy, silly things, knowing, these foreign banks know, that the IMF will come in, jack up the primaries, and even though that's at the expense of output foregone, the bankers will get their money back. So the bankers collude with individuals at the top levels of government who borrow for bad reasons, and they mortgage their country's future. Okay? This is a collusion between big banks, individual people, caused by the sovereign insolvency resolution system that exists. Quickly to go through, because I don't have pictures at the moment.
3-4
Yes.
minutes.
There is a completely different way of doing this, of doing sovereign insolvency, which I have built, you can see in the articles I've written, modelled on what the Federal Deposit Insurance System in the United States does in dealing with insolvent banks. It is preemptive. It says we do not wait until a bank, in the case of the FDIC, or in this case a sovereign, gets to the point where its debt ratio is rising before we have a debt write-off. No, It says the FDIC, we intervene to restructure a bank while it is still solvent. They've been doing this for 60 years. They've done it for hundreds of banks. This is not, we don't need to invent this new system from scratch. We can simply borrow from what they have done. There have to be some adjustments made because you're dealing with sovereigns, not with banks, and I can explain some of those things to you in Q&A if you want. It is perfectly technically feasible to do this. So what's the problem? The problem, as I mentioned, is creditors and individual leaders of borrowing countries like the system as it is. And that's why I'm speaking to you, because you guys tend to work outside of government. I don't see any Ministry of Finance officials in here. There was one person from the central bank, and she's scuttled out since. You guys work outside these things to bring pressure, and that's an audience that needs to get active. So the way you need to think about debt relief, in my view, is not on an individual country-by-country base, although there are individual countries that need it very badly. You need to think about getting together to work up and enforce a new system, to stop a system of debtors' prisons, and turn it into the same intellectual basis as we used for insolvencies of persons and of corporates. And that's what the FDIC thing would do. If you were to do that, if part of the benefits of all of this would be, for example, you greatly reduce the incentives of individual leaders to be corrupt. How does that work? Because if you remove the fact that there's going to be this primary driven up to 6 and put a ceiling on that, my proposal is the ceiling should never go higher than 2, lenders will take a lot harder look at an individual politician who wants to sign off a loan. Are they actually going to use that money in a way that is for the developmental benefit of the country, or are they lining their own pockets? The change in the insolvency system changes the incentives for corruption, which is why the leaders don't want it. But it's plainly of benefit to the citizens of the country, including the citizens of Jamaica. It would also do things like it was mentioned in one of the earlier talks, when you get countries which have big commodity booms, so their oil producer, oil prices shoot up. In those circumstances, more foreign money comes in and all kinds of waste and nonsense happens. When the boom comes to an end, everyone is crying. What this system would do is, in the course of the upswing of the commodity boom, bankers and so on would know, if this all goes bad, I can't force this primary surplus up to pay off my debt. I won't get my money. That makes them much more likely to put money into the peak of a commodity boom. So you change not just the way in which an individual country which is overly indebted get itself resolved, you actually change the system affecting countries which never get into that system in the first place. This has enormous global implications. Enormous global implications. Jamaica shows how much an individual country can benefit from this thing. The FDIC shows how you can actually do it in practice. The benefits globally are vast, and it needs you guys to get your heads around this and say, we shouldn't be focusing on debt relief for an individual country's case by case. We need a new system of preemptive sovereign insolvency.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Now it's Anne presenting Being Poor in the Current Financial Architecture, Implications of Foreign Currency Shortage for African Economies and Possible Solutions.
Yes, theory at first, then some empirical illustrations, and the problem diagnosis I promised. Then I proceed on to give like a very brief overview of reform ideas. Some were preempted by the preemptive sovereign debt mechanism Peter has just presented. And then, oh wow, first time ever that I put a picture in one of my presentations. My slides are the most boring slides ever. We go on to wishful thinking, which means we're going to indulge in the more radical versions of reforms, which include Keynes' idea of a global currency with an international clearing union, And the reform proposal I've said I'm going to focus on most, which was proposed by Robert Eisler, and which is in line with what has been said by Professor Kawoop this morning, which is like a one line of modern money theory. So my theoretical starting point is I look at the currency hierarchy with the most fungible of all currencies on the top being the US dollar, which performs like the three functions of money best, which is like the most accepted currency and therefore accepted in international transactions and debt contracts, followed by the yen, the euro, Swiss franc, pound sterling, and so on. So this currency hierarchy is said to come with a very high degree of variation and variability if you happen to be like a country with a peripheral currency, which is the case for most African economies. So this hierarchical ranking of currencies along their acceptance in international markets, it comes with a problem Aishin Green and co-authors coined the original sin, which means the inability to issue debt in your own currency. There are like two kinds of original sin. One is the domestic sin, where you're not even able to make economic agents accept debt instruments in your own currency who are placed in your domestic markets, but I'm more focusing on the international original sin. So this is still no news for you. The original sin, together with very volatile and low incomes and foreign currencies, do lead to a great dependency on international reserve currencies, which are important for peripheral countries to pay for imports, to redeem debt, and to conduct stabilization policies like exchange rates stabilization, which has led to recurrent debt crisis and accumulated debts. I am going to, and this is also the focus of my PhD, I'm going to look at the phase before and after the international financial crisis, which has led to a huge spike of debt levels in African economies, which was, like in the case of Latin America, fueled by excess liquidity due to low interest rate levels in the global north, together with like the dire need and necessity to generate foreign exchange by peripheral countries. Here I have to say sorry because I'm like not including Northern Africa. I'm using World Bank data, which still distinguishes between Sub-Saharan Africa and the Maghreb states, which are aggregated together with the Middle East. I know that this is problematic when you look at post-colonial arguments. Still, I do reproduce this prejudice, and by using this data, very sorry for this, I'm conscious of it though. So what I wanted to demonstrate here is that since 2007, after we've had like level of stalled growth, levels of external public debt, due to high primary commodity prices and like the mentioned TIPIC initiative and the MGR initiative, you have like a high level of debt since 2007, which was accompanied obviously with great financial inflows into those countries. And to demonstrate that there might be a problem, I put like a graph showing that those debt levels did actually come with an impeded ability to pay this debt back because export levels have dropped due to like slacking demand caused by the international financial crisis. So I'm now proceeding to a case study of Ghana, which is like, has an open capital account since the early 90s, and since 2007 it has been able to issue Eurobonds on international financial capital markets. Recurrently in 2007 it has its first bond issuance, and then in 2013 and 14 and 19 it got heavily indebted, and this has led to a stark appreciation of the Ghanaian cedi and high levels of volatility of the exchange rate, which you can see here. You've got like stark levels of debt rising and an impeded growth, impeded ability to actually pay those debt back. And as mentioned, and as has been observed in Latin American countries too, those inflows have actually led to a stark appreciation of the Ghanaian cedi, and has had implications for the volatility of the exchange rate, which has gone bonkers since 2017. Here you can see the absolute values of daily percentage changes of the nominal official exchange rate of the Ghanaian cedi against the US dollar. So the higher degree of volatility might have got something to do with the nature of debt, which has been at variable rates since 2007. Like the growth of debt at variable rates has grown significantly. I'll skip this. So I also included the case of Ethiopia, which still has a largely closed capital account, just to demonstrate that even in the case of a country still managing its exchange rate with no foreign bank ownership, you could see a stark appreciation due to capital inflows and issued debt since 2007. How much time have I got left?
15 minutes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
No, 12 minutes.
12 minutes. Okay, so nothing new for you. Foreign currency dependency is a huge problem, and comes with higher debt levels, though I would say that the debt levels themselves, they're not the problem, because if you're able to pay those debt back due to like booming export markets, then there's no problem. If you default in the current financial architecture and given the international financial institutions, your policy space is significantly reduced due to the conditionality Peter Doyle has just gone on about. So as I showed, the trend of like highly indebtedness, of which in the case of African countries is like about 90% in foreign exchange. Hence you have a huge currency mismatch between your debt and the ability to pay it back, because obviously if it was in your own currency, you could easily print off money and pay off debt at the risk of like causing inflation. But if you cannot, then the only potential for you is to default on your debt, coming with conditionality and possible restriction to international capital markets in the future if you have chosen to issue bonds. So, but what I particularly criticize, or what I think is particularly problematic, is basically the degree of volatility coming with those inflows. Again, as having been observed in Latin America, capital inflows come with not only with a continuous appreciation in average terms, but also a much higher degree of volatility if the exchange rate is kept flexible. And even if it's not, it poses like huge problems for economies with closed capital accounts, as in Ethiopia, who is currently discussing to open up its capital account due to foreign reserve shortages, which doesn't allow to stabilize and the exchange rate of the Ethiopian birr. Something I haven't mentioned before was basically that the higher volatility of I can't go back anymore. The higher volatility of exchange rate comes also with higher levels of interest rates, because if like a currency depreciates, this assets denominated in this currency do lose in value, which you have to compensate for by putting like a higher interest rate on it. If, on the other hand, volatility goes up and the currency appreciates, then obviously at some point a devaluation is going to be expected. Hence, you have to compensate for this higher risk by also paying higher interest rates on assets denominated in this currency, which summa summarum leads to like currencies having like a very high rate of fluctuation to have assets like to lead to higher interest rates. So this is like the theoretical background. They're like reinforcing problems of like the international financial currency hierarchy, which is absolutely detrimental to peripheral countries on the lower ranks of the hierarchy, who are commodity dependent and who therefore experience extremely high levels of indebtedness in foreign exchange, which comes with a very limited policy space. So now I'll proceed to possible solutions. Peter has just mentioned this. Some authors have suggested, including yourself, to reform the sovereign debt mechanism, which might include haircuts, which might include the installments of payments and the application of capital controls. Some authors have said we need truly international financial supervision going beyond the level of the Basel Accords, which has been dominated by the interests of G7 countries or other representatives of the global north. And others have suggested to create currency unions, which, due to their mere size, climb up in the international financial currency hierarchy and therefore improve the situations of the countries having those currencies. Others, more radical authors, have said, no, we need to go a step further. We need the IMF to be a provider of like counter-cyclical liquidity in times of recessions. The IMF has to independently create special drawing rights and throw them out in international markets in order to smooth out the high amplitudes currently visible. And there are still authors saying we need to go back in time. We need to go back to John Maynard Keynes' proposal to set up an international clearing union with a truly international currency, what he called the banker, which was like a currency basket of like the most important currencies. and we need to have like this truly international currency as like the means of transaction in international contracts, because all the current affairs, they come with like an extremely high degree of volatility. Yeah. So Keynes' proposal also mentioned like fixed exchange rates, which I have not mentioned. So I'm completely lost here. Oh yeah. So nothing new for you, but now there's going to be the interesting part of my talk, which is I am going to introduce you to Robert Eisler, who was like living in the 1920s and wrote 2 seminal books. One is called This Money Maze, and the other one is called Stable Money. And it's like an Austrian reformer. You actually can see all this. Who I think is extremely interesting in terms of modern money theory. He combines fiscal and monetary policies in his reform proposal and national as well as international coordination. His primary trajectories are full employment and what is even more important for him is stable purchasing power, which he summarizes by saying his main aim is a stable exchange value to avoid the scalar of deflation and the characters of deflation and characters of inflation. You have to regard this trajectory against the backdrop of him having gone through times of hyperinflation and depression of the 30s. So he asked the main question, namely, is it possible to organize an expansible currency with a monetary union having constant and stable purchasing power? And now our question might be, and I'd like to take this further in the discussion, it's basically a question which has been raised in by the audience earlier on, namely, is it possible to have like MMT policies in countries who are monetarily non-sovereign within the current financial architecture? So, and in regard to the current climate catastrophe, is it possible to do those policies in a way which make countries more resilient, greener, and more equitable? Because you might also have MMT, which aims at for war, yeah, basically. So MMT itself doesn't necessarily need to be progressive, right? So his reform proposal consists of 3 parts. One is public work programs, which he also says might be welfare payments, a parallel currency and a mutual stabilization credit system. So there's public work programs or higher expenditures on welfare, which is basically can be regarded as a remuneration for unpaid work. So hence also public work program is basically aiming to generate large-scale employment and to raise living standards by inducing wages. And this is like the MMT thought, like at his time, Chartalist thought, that is namely that this additional funds come from the central bank by directly crediting the central bank. So money is created out of nothing. And in order to avoid that, not so loud?
No, you're right. Because you only still 1 minute.
Okay. So in order to avoid that those public work programs or the additionally induced wages don't get exported in form of inflation elsewhere, you need to synchronize this money expansion by either synchronizing the lowering of the policy rate or by directly expanding the public expenditures. So when money is created beyond the point of like productive capacities, this might lead to inflation. So Eisler was thinking about how to preserve the function of money as a unit to store value, because he was, and this is an interesting thing about him, he was well aware of the problem of capital flight, of wealth and international finance in case of inflation. So what he thought up was a parallel currency system where one currency, which he called current money, it serves as a means of transaction for everyday payments. It's like you have to envision it to be like cash, and banco money, which is more of a inflation-adjusted means to store value, and this is more like the money you have on your bank account. So every time you pay in money into your bank account, a exchange rate between the two monies applies. And as I said, in order to stabilize price levels on an international level, you have within a federation, so he thought of this reform idea to be applied to several countries who agree to synchronize their money expansion and exchange at the beginning of their reform sovereign bonds in the volume of their trade volume. So those sovereign bonds are then among themselves used to pay for imports as a unit of a means of transaction for the trade among themselves, or debt contracts. And those bonds which are exchanged are also a means to ensure that one country does not trespass the before agreed on degree of money expansion. So whenever a country decides to expand its monetary basis beyond the agreed on degree, another country can sell off the country's A's bonds, which would lead to a drop of prices demanded for those bonds, which would put up the interest rates paid on these bonds, which would then curb inflation rates and the private money creation. So, and now we are going to maybe discuss about it. So basically my core question or core idea was in how far his reform proposal would actually lead to an improvement of countries' position within the international currency hierarchy in order to avoid the detrimental effects of it. So, yes, that's it.
Thank you, Anne. So I have one question for each of you, but I think I will take the audience questions first, because we have been quite long. So, est-ce que vous avez des questions? It could be in French or in English or in Arabic.
Just a precision. Can you give the first name of this economy, because I don't find his name on the
About Anne.
Aller?
Anne, about what she explained?
Yeah, because what is his complete name?
Robert Eisler.
Robert?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So Robert Eisler,
Eisler.
Robert Eisler, you don't find much apart from some, something I've written on him. But, he wasn't interested. He was basically a monetary freak, monetary reformer who was not really an economist, but who dedicated like a lot of thinking about monetary issues.
Okay.
I stumbled over him because there was a paper written about his reform proposal in the context of like overcoming the zero lower bound of central banking. So this is how I came across.
Is it the basis of MMT who explained Eisler? I mean, is it about MMT?
No, I would say he's a chartalist, but like, so it's a precursor version of the MMT theory. He himself didn't call himself a chartalist, but his writing expresses it. And yeah, he's not well known among MMT authors. Actually, not at all, I suppose. But yeah.
Is there other questions? Okay, so I'm going. Yeah. We have two questions.
Should I go first? Yes, please. So first for Peter, I think you were, can you clarify a bit? I got stuck on the mental exercise because I thought that we were living in a perfect universe on both the revenue and the spending side. So it's not very clear to me what difference the deficit makes if I can keep the same preferred perfect level of spending on both sides. You kind of, I think you copped out a bit by saying, well, you kill the NHS, which is clearly not anybody's, well, not, I would exaggerate, but not many people prefer the sort of expenditure cut, right? And for Anne, so I'm trying to think of how to connect your analysis of money hierarchies with this, in the sense, with your proposals, in the sense that money hierarchies reflect also particular international political economy of money, right? And I think you showed very well how countries in Africa are confronted with the problems of those. So why would the system solve those political problems? Or how could they? I mean, who would be in charge of this? What would be the institutional architecture around it? Because what you're doing here, in a sense, is you're talking about prices and how these prices could be fixed or managed, the prices of different currencies. But that's not necessarily the primary problem of the international financial architecture, that the prices are not right. It's the institutional structures behind those prices and the power structures behind those prices that matter, right?
Merci, bonsoir. Je peux parler en français?
Oui.
Vous représentez ici la FMI, c'est ça?
Non, non, non. Il a démissionné du FMI, il l'a accusé de plusieurs choses.
D'accord. Vous avez parlé de l'exemple Jamaïque et comment ils ont pu sortir de leur crise grâce à un programme contre la criminalité. Ici, chez nous, c'est la corruption. C'est comme si vous nous donnez un conseil, faire un programme contre la corruption, vous allez trouver des solutions pour votre crise économique. C'est ça?
I'm going to translate. So, la question c'est can we get the example of Jamaica?
Okay, Danielle, thanks for revisiting that mental exercise, because it is absolutely crucial. I was amused that I thought most people who put up their hands did get in what I view as the answer correct, but most people didn't put their hands up at all. So thanks for letting me come back to that. So, and which is always the right attitude, even ex-IMF economists. So let me just go through the thing. It's an exercise in comparative statics. Your particular problem with it was that my illustration of the NHS may not be the most advisable of the cuts to make. My answer to that is absolutely. But whatever cut you make, and a cut can come in on the expenditure side or an increase on the revenue side. So if we switch now to the revenue side, let's say we're now putting up taxes in order to adjust our primary by 1 percentage point from -4 to +7. By the time we've got to +7, we have greatly increased the burden of taxation on this economy. We have greatly increased the burden of taxation on the tax administration. So it may be the perfect tax administration, but you are just increasing the weight and its difficulty. As you raise taxes, they have the conventional disincentive effects on activity, which starts to reduce, according to the argument, the medium-term projection for output. So all I'm trying to do is isolate the effect of adjusting the primary on the supply side of the economy, and that's how I'm trying to illustrate the point. And you can do it on the expenditure side or on the revenue side, and you will get to the same answer, which is that that trajectory of output starts to fall. The point of the Jamaica illustration was to give an estimate of, well, how much is that? If you like, what's the elasticity? If you raise the primary from -4 to -3, what is the impact on the projection of output? Is it very big or is it very small? And what the case of Jamaica compared with its African comparators shows is that that effect is colossal. It comes out at 40% of GDP in 1 decade. It is enormous. So when folks like you, this group, have a general animosity towards the system of excessive debt and what happens to it and all those meetings for debt reduction, this, I believe, is the first opportunity you have had for somebody with some degree of authority to give you an actual number for what this costs in terms of output. And the beauty of Jamaica, how Jamaica does that for you, is that they did what they were told for 10 straight years. It's an incredible performance. The reason that's so unusual and why it's so informative is most other countries which have this kind of demand put on them collapse. Politically, they collapse under the pressure. And then the IMF comes and says to you, oh, it wasn't the design that was the problem. These authorities didn't try hard enough. They didn't keep going long enough. Jamaica blocks that rebuttal, which is why the IMF finds Jamaica so difficult to deal with when it's talking to me, because I know how to handle it and I know what they're up to with their arguments. So that is how the logic works. As you go from -4 to -3 to -2 in the primary all the way up to +7, you are wiping out the NHS, or you are jacking up tax rates. You are greatly increasing the frictions in this economy which hurt its growth by a very large amount. This not only helps you explain what goes on in Jamaica, it also helps you explain what happened in Greece. The same notion. On the question of corruption, if I can turn to that, I did try and explain in this particular case how a system of preemptive sovereign insolvency, which does not wait until debt ratios are rising before there's any talk of a write-down, but instead one which says you write down debt at the point where the primaries are starting to exact a cost on output. That switch. So you're now starting to write down debt even though debt ratios may not be rising. Debt ratios could even be falling, as in the case of Jamaica. Jamaican debt ratios fell over the last 10 years. They didn't have a debt write-off, they ran these enormous primaries. So the IMF says that's a success, we got debt ratios down. I say it's a colossal failure. You had output foregone of 40%. So if you change a system to that way, a preemptive solvency, you completely switch the incentives for creditors to lend. They now say to themselves, we can only lend to this country if we can get our money back without a primary jumping to 5, 6, or 7% of GDP. It has to be really productive stuff. We can't just lend this money to Idi Amin or somebody who's going to go, or Mugabe, and who's going to go and throw it away into some heap of rubbish. We can only lend it to a government which is as good as that of Botswana. And what that means is that it's now much more difficult for corrupt politicians to come to power because they don't have any money. The foreign bankers will not give it to them. And that's how you fight corruption, by this particular means of sovereign insolvency, by making it preemptive. There are, of course, many other things you need to do to fight corruption, but this is a really big one.
But Peter, about this preemptive insolvency sovereign regime, who do you think is responsible for that? Is it the citizens, the politicians, the the developed countries, or the developing countries who could be, who worked in kind of unions? Who is responsible to implement that or to?
Okay, it's a system of sovereign insolvency. The fundamental agency in the world for doing this work is the IMF. And what this thing would do, and I've traced it through the paper and so one of my pictures, which you didn't see, is exactly how the IMF would have to change its operation in order to do this. And there's a variety of different steps that I identify. So the IMF would play the role in this system, in my argument, that is played by the Federal Deposit Insurance System when it's dealing with US banks. So you need an agent which says, we now declare that this country cannot manage unless its primary goes bigger than 2. And since we're not willing to do that, we now say this country must have a debt write-off. And it would be the IMF that would step in at this point to do it. Now, if any of you have had any dealing with the IMF on debt reduction, you may know, hold on, Peter, the IMF always, even when it's now dealing with debt ratios rising, is very reluctant ever to say this country needs to have a debt write-off. Yes? The point about switching to a primary is that it's much more difficult for the IMF to waver. You can see whether the primary goes above 2. There's no debate. It does go above 2 or it doesn't. So it makes it much more straightforward by this measure to force the IMF to actually declare this country needs a write-off now in order to preserve output. And what this would do fundamentally, I will now make one more point, is that this whole system would return the IMF to its original articles of agreement. It's another way to make the case. The IMF was not established to preserve debt. The IMF, let me say that again, the IMF was not established to preserve debt. The IMF was established to preserve output. And what this system does is switch from a sovereign insolvent system which preserves debt to one which preserves output. It returns the IMF to its original Keynesian articles of agreement.
Thank you for your question, Daniela. And a comment to you, you might improve policy forces, but you might also, get rid of poverty, which you can achieve by welfare payment increases or whatnot. So that's a solution of a well-financed policy is maybe not the best. So the question to you is, the question to me by you was basically how this is going to improve individuals' countries' position in the currency hierarchy. I do absolutely agree with you. Obviously, to be in a good position in the currency hierarchy, you need to have a fully convertible currency. You need to have policies which do adhere to neoliberal logic, and with little state intervention and so on and so on. But you also need, and this is a reinforcing factor, have some sort of stability in order to find acceptance for your currency. So when you have as I showed earlier on, you have those banker monies who are inflation free, which already is a improvement of the credibility for this currency, and you have a federation using the same currency. I think as for the individual country, it might improve its position within the currency hierarchy due to lower degrees of volatility. But yeah, it's wishful thinking. But we can talk about this later.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for listening to all of us. Thank you.